And joining us now to debate the recession and the death of Macho for the full hour tonight. In Washington, D.C., Reihan Salam of the New America Foundation. In our nation's capital, Barbara Byers, Executive Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress. And here in studio, Armine Yalnizyan, Senior Economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and David Foote, Professor of Economics at the University of Toronto. And I'm grateful to have you two alongside here in the provincial capital, somebody in our national capital, somebody in America's capital. We're just full of capital this evening. Two really quite gloomy statistics to start with. I know you've all heard this expression before. The he session is what we're calling this, not the recession, the he session, because it's falling disproportionately on men. And we want to remind everybody before we show these charts that this is a Thursday night program. Thursday night means it's your agenda. We like to involve you in the discussion, and you can reach us on Twitter at twitter.com/theagenda or by email at theagenda@tvo.org. Lots of discussion on this topic, so please jump in and join the debate. Also, one more thing for you. Tonight, our fifth column blogger, Mike Miner, will be hosting a live chat. That's on our Inside Agenda blog on our website, tvo.org/theagenda. So log on, let us know what you and your fellow viewers think. Lots going on TV and online. Michael Smith, let's start with these graphics here. The United States of America, unemployment rate, August 2009. Men, 10.1%. Women, 7.6%. Those who call it a he session point to those numbers. In Canada, also a disparity. Age 25 plus, men 8.4% unemployed, women 6.1% unemployment. Armine, the stats say that 80% of the jobs lost in the United States are jobs lost by men since November. The number in Canada is 70%. Why are more men getting laid off in this recession than women?
You know, it's really easy to take this very personally and assume this has never happened before, but this is, if you look at it with the cool eyes of history, you'll see that this happens essentially in every recession, because the people that get thrown out of work are people that are making stuff, physical stuff, hard labor on assembly lines and in construction sites all over the country, and that's what slows down. So those are mostly guys' jobs, and it's later on that women get hit, and that's pretty typical in any recession. And so we're having the same phenomenon happening here in Canada, with 71% of the jobs lost so far being male. And a little bit of a she-covery, if you will, because there's women over 55 that are really picking up the pace of employment in a degree to which we haven't seen in previous recessions. But this is not anything new. Men kind of shudder when they lose their $30 an hour job, and the only thing that's facing them is $15 an hour jobs or fewer hours of work available. And women are willing to do those kind of jobs when the family finances need it to happen.
Reihan, you've studied the history of this. Would you agree that there's nothing particularly new about this he session compared to past recessions?
Well, I think that actually one needs to pay attention to the magnitude of what's going on. And I think in the United States in particular, what we did have is this huge artificial boom in the construction sector in particular. And the construction sector was very interesting because it actually represented huge gains in employment and income for men who have been battered because of their relative lack of education and skills. And so for those guys, it's very hard to imagine those kind of high-wage jobs coming back, whereas you could see some gentle uptick in the manufacturing sector. But what concerns me is that I think you're seeing lots of long-term trends cresting right now in something that might actually turn out to be structural, something that might turn out to be quite new. That is a higher level of structural non-employment, more economic dropouts from the mainstream economy.
David Foote, as you look across all sectors of the economy, is the he session hitting all of them essentially equally?
Well, no, but basically there are longer-term trends at work here, and I always try and infuse demographics into the discussion. And young societies, the demographically young societies, tend to have a big agricultural sector. And then gradually, as people age into their 20s and 30s, they buy their manufactured goods. And we saw the demise of agriculture and the growth of manufacturing. Canada went through that over the 60s and early 70s. And then you get the growth of the manufacturing sector gradually under pressure as more and more boomers move into their 40s and 50s, and now they want services, financial planning services, healthcare services. So now we're in the long-term transition of downsizing manufacturing and moving into the service economy. And men tend to be employed in the manufacturing sector, women tend to be employed in the service sector. That's the long-term shift, very predictable, that's been going on for now 50 or 60 years.
Barbara Byers, what do you think of this term, he session?
Well, I mean, I think there's nobody's going to dispute that certainly hundreds of thousands of men have lost their jobs. and that there's, as Armine has said, 71% of the jobs that have been lost by male workers. Now, you have to consider, though, that where women have made inroads into some of those non-traditional work, like, for example, in the manufacturing sector, in fact, although we haven't lost numerically the same number of jobs, on a percentage basis, more women have lost their jobs in there. But really, I don't think we should be putting this as a he session, because it's really a we session. We're all both in this together. Both genders are in it together. We're looking at this. There may be males in families that have lost their jobs, but there are also women in the public sector that have lost their jobs. There are women in the service sector. You know, when the economy starts to cool down, there's lots of people that work in hotels and restaurants and so on like that, who are already working at a less than full-time basis, that are finding their hours cut. So they may be employed, but by the way, the benchmark for employment is having 1 hour of employment a week. So it's not simply about saying that more men have lost their jobs. It's about what's happening to both genders and the shift. And by the way, we haven't seen what's going to happen in the public sector as more and more governments are coming out and saying, they've got deficits, they've got to deal with it. So we may not be seeing the same way that it's announced in the auto industry, but in the public sector, which is a lot of women's jobs and a lot of good paying women's jobs.
Okay, let me follow up on that men versus women's job for a second. We got this in via Twitter. And this person who wrote us said, both sexes are affected by the economic downturn.
Absolutely.
You just don't hear about secretaries, support staff, etc. let go before professional men. Reihan, Salam, based on your research, would you agree with that?
Definitely. I think that there's been a heavy emphasis. For example, if you're looking at this on a global scale, women are bearing much more of the burden of caring for children and also caring for older parents. In the United States, you have this phenomenon, and I think this is something you see in the wider Western world, wherein women work what is often called the second shift. That is, you have far more women participating in the mainstream labor market, but then they also bear a lot of the burden for, maintaining the household. And so I think that what you need to see is a kind of rebalancing of those gender roles, and we do see that to some degree, but that's one reason why women really are impacted by what looks like the economic decline of men in a very serious way. So to say that this is a he session doesn't mean that things are hunky-dory for women. Absolutely not. In fact, when you're looking at, for example, African Americans in our inner cities here in the US, you see this crisis where you don't have enough marriageable men, so that it's very hard to form two-parent families, and that makes it difficult to provide a kind of stable environment for children, simply because a lot of these men for decades have been incarcerated at high rates. They found their employment prospects sharply deteriorate, and I think what I'm really worried about is this phenomenon that we thought of as an inner city phenomenon, as a phenomenon of a kind of small minority, becoming a phenomenon of a larger and larger swath of the population, where women are bearing much more of the economic burden as well as the caregiving burden. And I think that's definitely not good news for women. It's definitely not good news for men.
We will follow up on that later in the program, but you said one word there, rebalancing, that I want to follow up with you, Armine. And I wonder if one of the, don't misunderstand the question here, one of the kind of perverse effects of this recession is that men who used to be making $30 and $40 an hour are now making $15 an hour, and the wage disparity between men and women is not as big as it once was. Is that happening out there?
It's too soon for us to be able to answer that question. Often income data takes a while for it to pull through, because what we know is that the wage gap between men and women really hasn't changed dramatically in the last 20 years, which is stunning. Well, as I said, we don't have the data yet. Yeah. But what we do know is that women have been getting more educated than men. Like, there's more female graduates than male graduates. Coming out of post-secondary institutions, and women are working longer hours. They're acting more like men did, but the wage gap hasn't shrunk in response to that. So that's, we don't know what's going to happen now. It could be just that we're seeing continued downward pressure on male wages at a more rapid rate than on women's wages, because women were already getting paid less. But that is in fact what has happened after the 1970s. Since the 1970s, men, especially young men, have been seeing continued downward pressure on their wages, whereas those aged 45 and up are seeing a real galloping revaluation of their wages in the last 20 years in comparison to their predecessors from a generation ago.
David Foote.
And it probably goes back, as Armine indicated, it goes back into the education system. The boys are dropping out of high school much more than the girls, even in Canada today. So in fact, some of this rebalancing is reflecting the education. Women have more education now. There's more women in our post-secondary educational institutions than men, yet there's more men in those age groups. And so what we've seen now over a long period of time is that we're not keeping boys in school. They're dropping out, and therefore they're not getting the opportunity to get higher education. And this is just a reflection of the education.
I mean, I think the other part of this is that, you know, we've never promoted that the road to equality is to bring down men's wages. I mean, what we've said is that the road to equality is in fact to bring up women's wages, to bring up their working conditions, to make sure that, for example, you know, there's a lot of discussion in this country right now on unemployment insurance, or employment insurance as some people call it. The reality is, as we've said, it needs to be modernized to meet the needs of the modern workplace, and that includes the fact that a lot of women don't qualify because they're not working the standard week. So we don't want to bring men's wages down, or their benefits, or their security down. We want to bring women up.
No, I understand. Barbara, you said something there curious a second ago. You said employment insurance, as some people call it. That's what the government calls it. What are you getting at there?
Well, because, I mean, there was a number of, a lot of us that say that it's still unemployment insurance. You're paying insurance because you're wanting to make sure that you have some minimal income at any rate when you're unemployed. And so a number of us still call it unemployment insurance because that's rightly what it should be. And it needs desperate changes to help both men and women workers, and there are different needs.
Reihan Salam, I have no hesitation in saying that the piece you wrote for Foreign Policy magazine in the July-August issue, called The Death of Macho, very much informed our discussion that we're having here this evening. And I'd like to read an excerpt from that and then come back at you with a question. Here's the excerpt. The era of male dominance is coming to an end, seriously. For years, the world has been witnessing a quiet but monumental shift of power from men to women. Today, the Great Recession has turned what was an evolutionary shift into a revolutionary one. The consequence will be not only a mortal blow to the macho men's club called finance capitalism that got the world into the current economic catastrophe, it will be a collective crisis for millions and millions of working men around the globe. Is this really the death of macho?
I think it is, and I think that a lot of what I was paying attention to are global trends that go outside of the affluent market democracies like Canada and the United States. When you're looking at China, for example, you have this huge emerging issue about gender imbalance in the composition of the population itself. And you also have heavy industries that are bleeding jobs at a rapid rate there, and I think that this is going to be a recipe for genuine instability. With regard to the point on education, this is another pervasive, very long-term trend that has suddenly become a lot more salient now that we've seen the number of construction jobs plummet. That was something that served almost as an industrial policy, almost as a solve for the fact that you have this kind of longer-term structural decline in the value of so-called less skilled work. With regard to what Barbara was saying, this raised a really interesting idea to me. It's something that I think a lot of us are familiar with. Women, in part, are flourishing now because women are more adaptable and more resilient. To some extent, this is actually not a very good thing, according to a lot of folks. I mean, they are less accustomed to some of the protections that we associate with the kind of unionized, blue-collar, so-called men's jobs of a previous era. And so in a strange way, women are actually optimized for this more casualized economy that I think folks like Barbara are trying to fight against. So I think that, Barbara wants to see leveling up so that, women can have privileges closer to those that male workers used to have. But I think that what we're more likely to see is a kind of leveling down in a world in which you're going to have weak consumer demand for a long period of time, high unemployment rates throughout North America and Europe. And I think that that's not going to go away.
David Foote, this death of macho expression, you buy it?
Not in the way that you would normally interpret it. Yes, I do buy it on the basis of the long-term trends that I talked about, both the education trends and the demise of manufacturing, the growth of the service sector, that men are increasingly in trouble in the new millennium. I got to be very careful about going globally because, in fact, Europe's much older than North America and China is much younger than North America. And so we would expect the manufacturing sector to be booming in China. We would expect problems in Russia because they're much older. So I'm very careful about going globally with this. But in general, the long-term trends have pointed to this for some time. In fact, the unemployment rate between men and women crossed over about 20 years ago, where men started to have a higher unemployment rate than women. And this recession has just emphasized that.
Reihan, you look like you want to come back for a second.
Well, I'll just point out that, you know, China and Mexico are oddly aging more rapidly than the United States and a number of other kind of industrialized countries.
But
so
not
it's
Canada.
true that China...
But
yeah,
not Canada.
yeah, and also partly it's because Canada has a very large foreign-born population, which is, you know, kind of something that's going to be a demographic boon. But I think that China has this kind of funny situation where, you know, they've had this fantastic, from their perspective, demographic balance between, you know, dependents and folks who are actually working. That's going to change really, really fast. And, you know, China has become a real engine of global growth, and if that engine stalls, that is going to be very bad news for all of us.
Let's get Armine and then Barbara.
Well, we were originally talking about is macho over? And I have to say that I think there's plenty of room for macho still in the world. There's still a lot of manly men in the manly world.
There's a lot of testosterone
And you know what? They're still all over Wall Street. They're all over Bay Street. They're in our, not only leading our nation's governments, whether they're at the national level or at the provincial or state levels. They're running the bureaucracies. Like, guys are running the world. But nothing much has changed because of recession. And I don't see them jumping out the windows and making room from the girl execs anytime soon. So I think the macho that Reihan has pointed out in his article is not so much a huge overconfidence of men and a confidence issue, but a willingness to take unnecessary risk. And that to me is not so much testosterone driven, but an insulation by virtue of money and power and prestige. So you can afford to take risks that people with less money can't afford to live with.
Barbara?
Well, there's 2 points on the question of women in education that's been raised by several people. I mean, what we know is that women of my generation, I'm a boomer, you know, we're told that the problem with the wage disparity was if women just worked longer, if they took less time off for having children, if they got more education, that the wage gap would close. And Armine's quite right that the wage gap didn't close, and in fact it's actually opened up more. And in fact, for university educated women, it's a bigger gap than even for women overall. So the question again is that we may be getting the education, but we're still not able to get the jobs that are paying good. And in terms of Death of Macho, I mean, again, I just look at this and say, wait a minute here, until we see that we have 50% of all of our legislatures and the parliament and our city councils are women, until we know that men are taking just as much time off for childcare as women are, as we know that, you know, men are taking more of a step forward on issues, for example, on violence issues. You know, there is still lots of macho there.
Okay, fair enough, but I'm going to read another excerpt from Reihan's article, and then you can all tell me if he and I are crazy here. Let's bring this up, Michael. Consider the electoral responses to this global catastrophe that are starting to take shape. When Iceland's economy imploded, the country's voters did what no country has done before. Not only did they throw out all the male elite who oversaw the making of the crisis, they named the world's first openly lesbian leader as their prime minister. It was said Halla Tomasdottir, the female head of one of Iceland's few remaining solvent banks, a perfectly reasonable response to the, quote, penis competition of male-dominated investment banking. Soon after, tiny, debt-ridden Lithuania took a similar course, electing its first woman president, an experienced economist with a black belt in karate named Dalia Grybauskaitė. On the day she won, Vilnius's leading newspaper bannered this headline: Lithuania has decided the country is to be saved by a woman. Reihan, is this a trend?
Well, here's the thing. You have radical discontinuities that happen in politics. For example, after Watergate, you suddenly saw a huge increase in the number of members of Congress who came from ethnic minorities, like Jewish Americans, Italian Americans, etc. Lots of folks who hadn't been represented in very large numbers before. No one saw it coming. It just happened all of a sudden. So you can see very, very quick political transitions that reflect deeper underlying trends. In New York City, where I grew up, 3 Asian Americans won election, or rather, all but one election in recent primaries. And before, you didn't have Asian Americans in there for decades. And they've been a big component of the population for a long time, but their representation hadn't caught up with their presence in the political and economic life of the city. So what I think is likely to happen is when you're looking 10 years out, as women actually exceed men in terms of educational outcomes, etc., you're going to see a very sudden shift toward far more female leaders in politics. But, you know, again, that's all very speculative, but I think that it's heading there because the men who would normally occupy those leadership positions are just not performing as well as women in their age cohort.
Armine.
You know, Reihan, you've got a great style of writing. It's extremely readable, but poking at Iceland, actually picking out Iceland and Lithuania actually ignores the fact that much larger countries like India with Indira Gandhi, or Golda Meir in Israel, or Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, much more powerful women have ruled, and the dudes came in after. And it wasn't like having a woman at the helm of society really changed life at all. So the question is not, is it a guy or a girl that's ruling? The question is, what style of leadership and on whose behalf are they governing? And I think that's why you want more women in politics, is to just to bring down the temperature.
Too much testosterone, not enough estrogen.
Yeah. Well, not enough caring about what happens to everybody, you know?
Barbara, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just, when I read the article, I did have to honestly chuckle, because it's like, oh my goodness, what has the world come to that they've that a country has elected a lesbian woman and she's going to save the country. I mean, the reality is it doesn't acknowledge that this woman may have been around in politics for a long time, has a lot of skills, all of those sorts of things. And we shouldn't say as well that because, as Armine has said, because that we get some women into some positions, that somehow sexism is dead. That would be like saying...
Oh, no one's saying that, though.
No, but I mean, that would be like saying in the U.S. that, you know, because the U.S. has finally elected an African-American, that somehow there's no racism anymore. Of course there is.
Yeah, I don't think he's saying that in the piece, but I think, David Foote, let me try this with you. Could there be a sense out there that, well, you know, Macho didn't work. These aggressive, too much testosterone, risk-taking Wall Street idiots got us into this financial crisis, and maybe we need to give a little more feminine approach a turn.
But what did we do? We bailed out the very people who got us into the crisis. The guys bailed out the guys who got us into the crisis. The evidence is all to the contrary.
That's right.
And the other people that are drowning, well, we don't have so much time for you guys, but you'll pay the bill for these other dudes.
The evidence is quite the contrary to what you just said.
Reihan, I see you shaking your head in Washington there, Reihan. If nothing else, you've provoked a good discussion, but come on back in and defend yourself.
Well, I think that this is not a very fair characterization of what I was saying in the piece. I think that, you know, Iceland and Lithuania, how are they different from Indira Gandhi? Indira Gandhi was part of a political dynasty. She did not represent a dramatic change in the actual social life of India. Rather, she was someone who actually represented the kind of ironclad grip of a kind of tiny political clique in that country. Whereas I think that what you see happen in Iceland, which is admittedly unrepresentative in a lot of ways, and I think that I tried to emphasize that, but I think what you saw there is a deeper structural shift that reflects these deeper structural trends. And so when you see a handful of politicians having emerged over the last 30, 40 years, I don't see that as significant. What I'm anticipating, and this is necessarily speculative, is that you're likely to see a deeper change reflecting, again, these deeper trends. Now, with regard to the educational piece, I think that I can't speak to the statistics in Canada. What we have seen in the United States is that in entry-level positions, women and men who have similar educational credentials actually have seen that gap close. There's a sociologist at NYU, Robert Max Jackson, who wrote a wonderful book called Destined for Equality, the basic argument of which is that the logic of collective organizations is that discrimination becomes difficult because it becomes expensive. When you see that women are actually outperforming men, it simply becomes not viable if you're a profit-making enterprise to actually exclude women from positions of power and authority, which is why bloodless capitalists, ruthless capitalists who are not friendly people, are seeing to it that they adapt their institutions so as to draw on women's talents because they need to in order to survive in a competitive environment.
Okay,
so I think that, this is an evolving situation.
Armine.
I think the reason why those bloodless, ruthless capitalists are doing it is because women are cheaper and they're not letting the women up into the decision-making levels of the organizations. Yeah. And just going back to the general thesis about the death of macho, you got to ask yourself, is that such a bad thing based on everything that you're saying? Maybe we do want less irrational exuberance on Wall Street. Maybe we do want less risk-taking.
The whole point of my article is that it's a good thing, but please continue.
Well, and I think we should talk about that because the way your article is written is very much that this is a terrible thing and guys are going to suffer all over the world. Guys and girls are going to suffer all over the world if we don't get our act together.
I think that's what you may have interpreted, but that certainly wasn't my intention.
Well, I mean, but I think that it certainly, when I read it, it's the same thing. It's also setting up this sort of war of the genders,
right on.
of somehow, but that women are getting ahead and guys are falling farther behind. And that's why I said it's not really a he session, it's a we session, because we're all in this together. As long as men are losing jobs and women are in underpaid part-time jobs, then we're both in quite a mess together. And I think Armine's quite right when we talk about. I would love to see a world that was managed and ruled by more of the qualities that women bring to it. But I've also seen, quite frankly, what happens to women in all sorts of occupations and positions that when they try to bring that in, they get crushed by the boys, and that this isn't the way we do things. I mean, Maggie Thatcher, I don't consider was a sister of the feminist movement.
She'd be glad to hear you say that.
Yes. Yeah. But I mean, I take a look at it. She wasn't bringing in those different skills, and she wasn't valued for having different skills. She was valued for being more just like one of the guys.
Yeah, for sure. David Foote, if you look at how the governments all across the Western world have responded, they have overwhelmingly gone to what everybody loves to call shovel-ready projects, which you have to assume favors men. Isn't that right? The political response has been, well, let's get those men back to work.
Well, first of all, remember, they haven't turned out to be shovel-ready, most of these projects. And by the time they finally come online, we probably won't need them nearly so much anymore. Secondly, inevitably, if you look at infrastructure, it's going to be construction. And so if you're going to use this to upgrade infrastructure, then obviously you're going to favor construction. But I think if we're going to go to shovel-ready products and infrastructure, we should be greening our buildings a lot more. We should be using environmental type, not new buildings, not new bricks and mortar, but taking the older buildings and making them much more environmentally sustainable. So as we move forward, we're in a much more cost-effective environment. We're not even talking about those things in most countries. Something like 12% of Canada's infrastructure spending has any green things attached to it.
Barbara.
Yeah. Well, the other part of it is that there's two pieces of this. We've said at the Canadian Labour Congress that yes, the infrastructure programs are important, but there's different kinds of infrastructure. And again, there's the shovel-ready things, but there's also childcare as infrastructure. It helps working families, both women and men, to be able to go to work and to have some confidence in that. And the other thing that we're concerned about is that, quite frankly, when these projects start to go and cities or provinces say we're running short on cash, they're going to start to cut jobs in the public sector or not embark on jobs that are needed, like in childcare or in healthcare, and it will be women's jobs or predominantly jobs that are held by women that are going to end up suffering, and so we're going to set up yet another barrier. Will the advancement on the infrastructure programs come at the expense of women who are already carrying a heavy load?
Let me do a follow-up here, another excerpt from Reihan's article, and then I'll get him to comment on it. At the height of the Great Depression in 1933, 15 million Americans were unemployed out of a workforce that was roughly 75% male. This undermined the male breadwinner model of the family, and there was tremendous pressure to bring it back. The New Deal did just that by focusing on job creation for men. Insulating women from the market by keeping them in the home became a mark of status for men, a goal most fully realized in the post-war nuclear family. Rosie the Riveter was a blip. In this way, according to historian Stephanie Kuntz, the Great Depression and the New Deal reinforced traditional gender roles. Women were promised economic security in exchange for the state's entrenchment of male economic power. Reihan, just go on a bit more. What are you give us a greater sense about what you're trying to say here.
Well, what I was trying to say, and this is why I'm so surprised and disappointed to see my article misunderstood, which could reflect my failings as a writer or the failings of my idiomatic matter of writing, is that what you saw entrenched was an extreme form of gender inegalitarianism that reflected the ideology of the time. And I think that what you're seeing now on a global scale is a kind of emerging conflict between gender egalitarian and gender inegalitarian societies. For example, a place like Iran is a country where women have advanced in educational terms beyond men, yet women are excluded from positions of economic power to such an extent that it's built up a tremendous amount of political rage and anger in that society that we saw erupt after the last presidential election. That is not a good thing. And I think that we in the West have started to move away from that in a more gender egalitarian direction, which you also see in, though men are not adequately sharing child care duties or elder care duties, they're actually taking a part far more in those activities than they had in earlier eras. You even see this among working class men in the United States. And I think that that is a very positive step forward. But the issue is, while some men are able to adapt to this new gender egalitarian landscape, other men have not adapted as successfully. And I think that there are some folks, I'm not going to name names, but who see things always in a victim-victimizer kind of framework. And I think the world is a lot more complicated. There are people who are victimized who oftentimes are victims themselves, and vice versa. So I think that, I definitely don't want to pit this as, kind of men versus women. I think it's a very complicated picture in which we all have to think about the kind of wrenching adjustments that we are all going through, women and men.
Okay, if you look at the institutions of higher learning across North America, though, and David Foote, let's go to you with this one. Women dominate men in almost across the board. I think that more, next generation is going to have more women doctors, more women lawyers, more women journalists, more women financiers, everything. Does that not support Reihan's theory that male dominance is, in fact, on the way out?
No, because there's no guarantee, as Barbara very rightly pointed out, the front end of the baby boom, the women in their 50s now were told, if they got a better education, that by the time they get to their late 40s and early 50s, they'll have enough time and experience in their careers that they'll get to the top. Are they at the top of the presidents of our five main banks? No. Are they at the top of all our hospitals? They're almost all the employees are dominantly women, but they're still, the men are at the top.
But those men would have graduated 30, 40 years ago.
The women now are in their mid-50s. They're the same age as those men, and they had better education. There is no guarantee. That glass ceiling still seems to be very firmly in place.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, when you look at every occupation, women on average earn less than men, and it doesn't matter about the educational qualifications and all of those sorts of things. There's only one occupation where women earn on average more than men do, and that's as nannies.
As nannies. David, go ahead.
Oh, another little point here that needs to be factored in, and is the number of hours people work. And men tend to be more workaholics than women. Women tend to have much more balance. So women, for example, women doctors work less hours, so they have lower incomes in total. So there's this question of hours work, work-life balance, whether we should all have full-time jobs and that sort of thing. And that factors also into the incomes. In general, women bring more balance to the workplace, men bring more workaholism to the workplace. I won't pass judgment on which is better or worse at this stage.
Can I get you to? I actually wouldn't mind having you pass judgment on that.
Oh, I'm arguing that as the boomers get into the 50s and 60s, we need much more, they want to continue working, but not full-time. And so a lot of boomers would love to work 3 days a week for 60% salary. But the workaholics of the world say, we want 120% of your time, not 60%. And you can't get flexible workplace options, even for men in the workplace, because the workaholics are all at the top of our organizations, whether it's government or the private sector.
So what do you want to do with those workaholics?
Well, the question is, are those values going to continue to predominate? If they are, we're going to have increasingly risk-taking and more.
And I think the evidence also shows that the work that's been done about work-life balance is that the younger workers, younger generation, they're prepared to work hard, they're prepared to provide a good service or provide a good product, all of those sorts of things. They're prepared to do all of that, but they're not prepared to hand their lives over to their companies. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I think that one of them is that they've seen what's happened to people of my generation who did work hard, and then when the companies decided that the person was expendable, they were expendable. There was no loyalty. But the other part of it is that those same generations are saying, wait a minute, my parents, both women and men, missed important family events, missed spending time, and I'm not prepared to do that with my family.
They want a life.
They want a life, and they're going to get a life.
David.
My students are saying exactly the same thing I said when I was in my 20s. Nothing has changed. I'm not going to be a workaholic like my old man.
But there will be, you think?
Oh, there's nothing like a kid and a mortgage to get you focused.
Barbara, tell me this. You've got so much experience on the labor scene. We have obviously seen lots of men and women get laid off over the last period of time since this recession started. Do men and women react differently to being laid off?
Well, I think, again, it depends on the kinds of jobs that people have. And what they see as the effect. It depends on the kinds of other relationships that they've got. If you're in a situation where one partner, for example, a man in the manufacturing sector, is losing a full-time, a good-paying job with benefits and security, or what he thought was security, it's devastating for the whole family. If the partner is also either having their hours cut or totally losing their job, but it tends to be a lower paid job with less security. People can feel like they can go around and find something that's going to be, you can always find something that's just as bad as what you had. But I think that there is that. Women have gone through a lot more of these downturns as well, in the terms of losing their part-time jobs and having to go out and look for more. I think the difference we're seeing right now is it is very much a male face to what we're seeing when the factories close, when the lines shut down, when there's a threat of a company going under.
Armine.
Yeah, I think the question that you've asked of Barb goes back to Reihan's original thesis about ideology and how that shaped the response to the Great Depression and men being thrown out of work. And it might be ideology, but I'm an economist, the most macho of all professions, I think. And from an economics point of view, something happened in the Depression and the war that led to this shift in so-called ideology on what role women should take in the labor market. Because when the war started, the men went off to fight the war, and the women were asked to pitch in. So ideology was thrown out the window for pragmatics, is we need you to be making these munitions and to be doing all the production that the men are no longer here to do. And the women dutifully went back home when the war was over. But very shortly after the war, the big war, the Korean War was over in the 1950s. And both in Canada and the United States, we experienced a very deep recession, and in both countries, a deflation for a period of time. And again, women who had just been in the labor market a few years ago came back into the labor market to support their families because they knew they could work. And they were willing to pick up work to maintain family finances. And so you get this kind of continual reinforcing that, yes, I can make a difference to my family's finances. And if I just work another 6 months, we can afford to go on a vacation. Or I can buy some of the stuff that this new mass manufacturing is unleashing as, the new consumer society. So you had not so much ideology as pragmatics and like the gifts of economics.
Well, let me follow up with Reihan on that, because I wonder whether, this may be a stereotype, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, do men tend to see themselves, do they tend to, self-identify so much more than women through their jobs, so that when they lose those jobs, it is psychologically a much more crippling blow for men than it is for women? What do you think?
Well, Stephanie Kuntz, the feminist historian I cited earlier on, has talked about how men's roles have evolved over the last several decades. And it's certainly true that men used to have primarily a breadwinner identity. Their identity was their work in the market. And that's increasingly changed so that men increasingly see an essential part of their identity as being fathers, being husbands, etc. But I would say that that is a transition that's not complete. And I think that particularly when you're looking at men who are working class, men who come from sort of different kinds of cultural backgrounds, I think that they do tend to place very high value on that breadwinner role, so it can be more difficult for them. And I think you see this in interesting comparative perspective. For example, in Russia and Eastern Europe after the collapse of communism, you saw women prove far more resilient, far more adaptable to the new set of economic circumstances, where you had huge numbers of men dropping out of the mainstream economy. Similarly, you have this dynamic where in the United States over the last 50 years, female labor force participation has steadily increased, whereas male labor force participation has actually decreased. And so you have a higher overall labor force participation rate, but it has actually kind of varied by gender in this very funny way. Armine's point about ideology, well, I just want to emphasize that by ideology, I mean gender ideology in a very, very broad sense. And of course, it's shaped by objective economic realities. But it is interesting that these objective economic realities also made the labor market position of lots of working class men deteriorate in such a way that it plays into this broader thesis.
Armine.
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing about labor force participation of women being on a rise in the post-war period, it needs to be taken into account. What you need to take into account is every time it has gone up has been in response to a recession. So it kind of scoots up when there's a recession because guys are losing their jobs and girls are more willing to take crummy jobs just to make ends meet. And then it kind of plateaus at that higher level, and then we get another recession and up goes women's labor force participation until at this point, before we got into this recession in Canada, and I'm sure this is similar in the United States, Ran, here we had 50% of all employees are women. So essentially men and women are shouldering the same burden of work. So when men start losing their jobs more, the only group that's left now to kind of pick up the pace is the over 55s. And both men and women are, but more women that are over 55 are getting employed now in the middle of a recession.
Barbara?
Yeah, well, I just want to comment too. I mean, the question was raised, is it more devastating for a man to lose his job than for a woman to lose his job? I think it's equally devastating for both of them. I mean, it's
But
tough.
I'm not talking about financially, Barbara. I'm talking about this. If you're a guy who's worked 30 years in the mill, in a macho job, cutting wood, logging, and you lose your job, and suddenly now maybe you're, I don't know, maybe you're doing some part-time nursing that you've been retrained to do instead, is that a more crushing blow to the psychology of somebody suffering in a recession than a woman who may lose a nursing job and is doing something else?
Well, because how many of us also define ourselves by what it is that we do? So
Well, that's what I'm saying. Don't men do that more than women?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I think if you talk to a woman, if you talk to a woman who was a secretary in office, or a woman who's a nurse, or a woman who works on the line in an auto plant, if she loses her job, it's devastating too for her because she has the same insecurities about.
They're both smiling at me here in the studio. Hang on, what are you smiling about, David?
I don't think a woman host would have ever asked that question.
Well, I'm saying it's a stereotype, and I'm just asking if it's true.
That's what I was laughing
Okay.
at.
Well, in fact, I think you're onto something, Steve.
Tell him.
Interestingly enough.
Tell him.
No, and the reason I say that is because I think women do think of various parts of their lives more frequently at the same time than guys do. That
We're
guys
used to multitasking.
Yeah, and it goes back to what David was saying, that a woman is not likely or as likely to say, I'll give you my life to their boss, whereas a guy is. And I think it's this notion of devotion. I'm giving my life to this job in order to support my family, blah, 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 blah. But women are not as likely to want to devote themselves, and I use the word religiously, devote themselves to the job, as a guy is likely to do. We're more likely to be devoted to our families. So I think there is a categoric difference, and maybe that's why there aren't as many women decision makers. Because we're not willing to devote ourselves to the job and nothing else.
Well, and because the job also demands it. I mean, if I think of even in the labor movement, I mean, the standard when I got active has been, that you work the long hours in order to be devoted to the movement.
Right on.
But it was the standard that was set by guys who had decided that that was more important than being devoted to their family. And therefore, if a woman didn't devote that amount of time, then she wasn't obviously as useful.
Has that changed?
I think that there's some changes in particular because of both young men and women workers who are activists, who want to be activists, who are wonderful, wonderful people, but again are saying, and I'm going to have some other piece of my life as well. But I think, it doesn't matter where you are. there's still machoism wherever you are. And whether it's the labor movement, business, politics, academics.
Speaking of politics, Barbara, forgive my interruption, but we just had a graphic come up. Somebody either tweeted or emailed us and said, on this issue of the political temperature of the day, Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, Sheila Copps, Sandra Pupatello, do they bring down the political temperature? Anyway, that's a little aside. That's a little aside. Reihan, you look like you wanted to get in back there.
Yeah, just one thing I want to mention is that I think that there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of work lifestyle preferences. And I think that there's somewhat more diversity among women than there is among men. I think that you see men in general trending towards wanting to spend more time at home, wanting to spend more time as caregivers, putting less exclusive focus on their work identity and more on their family identity. But at the same time, when you're looking at women, there's a wonderful sociologist, Catherine Hakim, and also there's Neil Gilbert at Berkeley, who've done a lot of interesting work about how when you're looking at women, you have one group of women who, even during the era when gender conformity was all the rage and women were strongly discouraged from working, really did want to spend all of their time, or the bulk of their time, in the marketplace, working jobs, earning an income. That was really crucial to their identity. Then you have this other group at the other end, where even if they were strongly encouraged through the tax system to work, they would much rather stay home and look after the household, which again is very strenuous work that we as a society don't always recognize. And then in between you have this group that is very responsive to the different kind of social policies, the different kind of tax policies that you're offering. And so I think that one thing we need to be mindful of is how, you know, a set of policies that looks like it's totally objective and fair actually impacts these different people very differently. It impacts men differently from women, and it impacts some of these women who are more home-oriented versus those who are more market-oriented very differently. So I think that, you know, I think a lot of us have this instinct to say that, no, everything's exactly the same, we're all the same, we're all impacted the same way, we're all hurt in the same ways, we're all sort of et cetera. But I think that the reality is that this heterogeneity really makes the economic world this kind of weird kaleidoscope where the same job loss impacts, you know, two different people or otherwise similarly situated very differently depending on how they see themselves.
In which case, David Foote, let me follow up with this. Are we, you know, filtered through your prism of demographics, which I know you like to look at the world through, are we moving towards a time when more and more women are going to be the prime breadwinners in families all across the Western world?
I'm not sure that that is going to be the case because we're looking at aging populations. Women still shoulder most of the caregiving responsibilities, and their caregiving is gradually moving from their children to their parents. So more and more women now in aging societies in their 50s and 60s are going to be taking time out to look after their aging parents. They're not necessarily going to be wanting to go back into the labor market and or be in the labor market full time. It fits in with a lot of the other discussions that we've just had about caregiving and all the rest of it. So just because you've finished raising your children doesn't mean that caregiving is over. Whether it's regarding society, it may just be starting for your parents.
Well, and then for a lot of women too, in particular, they're finding that because there is no child care, that they're ending up looking after their sons and daughters' children, their grandchildren, because and that's not what they intended to do with their later years.
I was going to ask, willingly or not in most cases, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think I've talked to lots of people who have grandchildren who say, I love my grandchildren a lot. I really like having them visit, but I never intended to be their full-time caregiver. And by the way, I want my children to have my grandchildren to have something more. I want them to have trained early childhood development people in a trained child care center. I want them to have the benefit of that. So grandparents it's not just about not wanting or to spend the time there. It's about they want their grandkids to have the best jump on things as well.
Armine, obviously manufacturing has taken a major kicking over the last several years in Canada and the United States. Can you tell us, if and when we come out of this recession and some of those jobs come back, lots of them obviously won't, can you paint us a picture of what a more feminine manufacturing sector might look like?
Oh, wow, what an interesting question. I have no crystal ball, so I'm really thinking off the top of my head here, and I think part of it is not so much about femininity as, again, the external exigencies of high oil prices, more concern about the earth and environmentally sustainable practices, and having more local and maybe smaller scale production, maybe more human scale production of our needs would be, is it feminine? It's more sustainable. It's a more human scale. That might be on the horizon because of this clash, this kind of convergence of concerns about the cost of oil and the cost of shipping, therefore, and the price of the global supply chain. And also these concerns about how much money, how are we producing what we're producing.
Right. David?
My crystal ball, for what it's worth, would suggest that we will move into much more niche manufacturing, smaller scale manufacturing. The big global manufacturing will go to the younger countries of the world, the Mexicos and Chinas of the world. And I heard what Reihan said about the question of whether China gets rich before it gets old or old before it gets rich. It's a side issue. But right now, they're the ones who are going to take the big manufacturing. We're going to get into niche manufacturing. And I think if we're smart, we'll build in the environment. I would add one more thing to what Armine said, and it would be more cooperation and less competition.
Yeah, yeah.
That is a feminine characteristic.
I'm saying that that is more likely to be part of that world if we were to answer your very interesting question about what it might be more like.
Reihan, we've got a minute left here. Why don't we go from the sublime to the ridiculous? Can you imagine Wall Street being run by women?
Absolutely. In fact, I think that this has been one very potent criticism of the article. It's that if you have the same kind of institutions, you could have women playing those roles and things being fundamentally the same. And I think that given women's educational attainment, I think it's very likely that you're going to see women playing more and more leading roles in that sector.
Now, lest anybody misinterpret what I meant by that, the sublime to the ridiculous, Reihan, you know I didn't mean that you were ridiculous. That's number one. And number two...
I take great pride in being ridiculous.
No, but I wasn't saying it. I wasn't saying it.
How feminine of you.
And number two, I was certainly not saying that the notion of a majority of women running Wall Street is ridiculous. It's probably a fantastic thing, and we might have avoided all of what we've been going through over the last several months. But it is a hard notion to get your head around, considering that the people who run all these banks and financial institutions have all been 60-year-old white men. So that's what I meant.
If I can just add on the question.
20 seconds left, Barbara.
The more equal, it would be, workplaces wouldn't be more feminine, they would be more equal. It wouldn't be about, yes, the environment, but it would be about more work-life balance. It would be about people getting fair pensions, both genders, at the end of their work days, all of those sorts of things, that we would actually be bringing the level up rather than driving things down. And I think that would be a better workplace.
Barbara, you get the last word tonight. Can I thank all of our contributors this evening? Reihan Salam from the New America Foundation in Washington, Barbara Byers from the CLC in Ottawa, here in Toronto, Armine Yalnizyan from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and David Foote, the economics prof, boom, bust, and echo, still one of the best I've ever read, from the University of Toronto. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Now, for more information about tonight's guests and StatsCan's latest labor force survey, visit us online at tvo.org/theagenda. Tonight's program is produced by your agenda producers Navin, Vaswani, and Mike Miner. And you can read Navin's post about women in the male-dominated world of high finance. That's on our Inside Agenda Producers blog. You'll find that on our website, tvo.org/theagenda.